I actually have something embarrassing to admit. Your channel, I never actually learned economics, so I don't know how I could possibly unlearn it.
Unlearning economics, I think. I mean, I don't know. It's a bit of a pretentious name, let's be honest, but it's a name that I think speaks to the idea that often people think of economics as something that's like very fixed and very doctrinaire, right? And so when I talk about unlearning economics, what I really mean is like approaching it with a fresh mind. So, I think that's basically what my channel aims to do.
I don't think it's pretentious at all. I actually,
Are you a bit pretentious though? I don't know. Are you the best judge of that?
um, yeah, I would actually think that I'm very much lacking in pretense for the most part. I don't think I take myself very seriously. I don't have a British
That is
accent
true.
either, which automatically sort of redoubles.
Yeah, it's an effort putting the accent on every day, I have to say.
I you know, because in LeftTube,
Mm.
obviously we're not exactly lacking for like sociological or criminological analyses. I feel like those are all about the place. Um, but one of the things that I really really like about your channel is that it feels kind of like an insider's take, like you talking about like toxicity in your field, or you talked about how economists are really really bad at citing from other disciplines, and that's the sort of thing. I mean, it seems like those critiques would only come from a person familiar, I guess, or somebody who had to spend like 6 years, talking with these people. Um, and I think it's a very valuable insight. I don't think it's pretentious at all to call that unlearning economics. I mean, what are most like YouTube lefty types working with here? I mean, I'm a bachelor's. What do most of them have? Wikipedia educations? I think you've earned it.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, you've touched on like both of, I would say, the main motivations for the channel, right? Like, one is just bringing economics to LeftTube because apart from anything else, there just wasn't any, and I started getting into LeftTube videos around the time people like ContraPoints and Philosophy Tube were starting to get, six figures, well into the six figures views. And I think that's when a lot of people who maybe weren't really on YouTube a lot, which includes me, started noticing them. But I was just there was just no economics there. It was all kind of like you said, sociology and the culture wars and everything, and worth pushing back on the absolute tripe that was on YouTube about those issues, and which still is to some extent to this day, absolutely. But I just thought there was a definite gap in the market because it seems to be that lefty people, in a lot of ways, I don't know if I'd call it our main argument, but certainly one of our central arguments is economic, right?
Oh, well, yeah, it has to be. And it's frustrating, and I think you've said this before too, so I might be cribbing this directly off you, but uh, people on the right will treat sociology like a fake field, like a completely made up, like whenever it's inconvenient
Mm.
for them to acknowledge sociological reality. People on the left do the same thing with economics, unfortunately, where there's this prevailing sentiment of like econ is fake, which in like a mimetic sense I get. I mean, in a socially constructed money is fake, debt is fake. Okay, fine, sure, if you're having fun with it. But obviously, it's no more fake than, say, race or gender, but we spend plenty of time analyzing those things. A lot of lefties seem to think that like legitimately time spent understanding economics is wasted, which, I mean, do you know who the essential like founder of leftism? I mean, Marx was an economist. I don't know if you can get around that really. That avenue, that study.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you see these takes, and I think there's a bit of a background to this. It's kind of interesting because I've thought about it quite a lot. And I think what's happened over the past few decades, especially, is that the right claimed the mantle of economics, right? They say, you don't know Econ 101, you don't know basic economics, supply and demand, lefties just don't understand it. It's how the world works. And they've used that to advance a particular view of policy and basically free market policies, right? So the right has kind of claimed that mantle, and I think it. I mean, number one, it's a completely incorrect conception of even what mainstream economics really is. Mainstream economics can be lots of different things. There are lots of conflicting theories in it, and there's no reason to accept the free market one over another one.
Mhm.
But I think also important is how the left have reacted, which is exactly what you said, right? You just see, for example, you see like viral tweets, and I always wonder how much attention we should pay to Twitter, but you see tweets with like tens of thousands of retweets, saying stuff like, "Guys, the economy is just made up. We can just do what we want," and yeah, like you said, the economy is socially constructed. Things like how we calculate GDP, they depend on choices that can be different for sure. But ultimately, you're going to have to think about how are things produced, how are they distributed, who do they go to, and how you organize all of this. Is there trade, are there markets? What role do these play? You're going to have to think about these things if you want to have any kind of semblance of a modern functioning economy, and things that we all use, right? So I just really don't like it when the left reject economics. I mean, I think you see it from anarchists quite a lot. I would say they're the kind of the worst offenders, and I say that as somebody who has like strong anarchist sympathies. But you see them just say, somebody asks, well, how would the economy work? And they're like, well, people would just give each other stuff. If you need like an operation on your teeth or something, then you just go down the road and the guy exchanges some berries with you for it or something like that. So I just think there's been a lack of thinking, and it has been this reaction to the right saying that economics implies free market policies, and the left saying, well, you know what, then economics must just be a load of crap. There's no reason for it.
Yeah, first of all, the fact that you said all of that makes me wonder how much of my stream you've seen in the recent months, because this is a tremendous frustration of mine. The idea of ceding economics as a field to the right is just so misguided, when their biggest contribution to economic thought in the past like half century has been trickle-down economics, at least here in the States, which is as close to mathematically incorrect as an economic theory can get, like a guiding principle of sort of social wellness. And, it's completely brain dead. And I think a lot of lefties are like, oh, well, economics must be wrong. It's like, no, they're wrong. Like, that'd be like dismissing sociology or criminology because conservatives are arguing for broken windows policing, or saying that getting rid of the welfare state will make black people more motivated to work or something. Like, you can't dismiss the field just because they've come to the wrong conclusions. That's the only thing they can do. The thing that God, the econ stuff really really bothers me, because the a common lefty argument, right, is the
Mm.
idea that scarcity is a kind of coercion. It's a kind of oppression. If you don't have enough food to eat, if you're poor in America, you probably have enough food to eat. Maybe it's likely, at least, but maybe you don't have enough other things, or you're strapped for resources. It would follow then that if scarcity is a kind of oppression, that abundance is a kind of liberation. The more efficient your economy, the more it can produce, the more the average person has access to, the less likely they are to fall prey to any of these natural inequalities of scarcity or lack. And but when lefties talk about like their like conceptual future system, sometimes it seems like that goes out the window. Like, what do we do to make the average person more liberated? And their conception economically, it seems to be some kind of pre-industrial revolution. Like, they don't say that, but in terms of like the organizational structures, like you're regressing to an almost like feudal state where people just have like buddies in their neighborhood, and like, oh, like here's the guy who makes orthopedic shoes. It's like, really? That's what you want? Like, you want glasses to take like 2 months of one person's time, like like carving a lens and like shaping metal? Like, that's the direction you want to take things? And it's like, God, fuck, I would almost rather be run by neoliberals. Holy shit, I can't trust you people with an economy. Jesus Christ, like they have to fix this.
Yeah, absolutely. It. I think I agree with what you said about kind of scarcity, and I guess you could say imposed scarcity, right? Being like a form of coercion, because the question of like how property is distributed, right? Who owns what? How much the different groups and individuals have access to resources. I think that is really fundamentally a question that leftists need to address, because it is just about liberation. Being in poverty is hugely coercive, it's hugely time consuming, it's hugely mentally taxing. And I think one of the things that leftists can shine a light on is that a lot of this scarcity, perhaps not 100% of it, but a lot of this scarcity is imposed. And, it takes just a good set of policies. And to be honest with you, I wouldn't say it's the most complicated set of policies. I don't think it's rocket science half the time. I think some of it's as simple as, for example, what a lot of countries have done over the past couple of years, giving people money so that they can afford to live. Some of the policies are maybe more complex, but it doesn't have to be too complicated. But what you're doing is you're liberating people from the coercive constraints that are imposed on them by the current system, and that's just a drum that I think leftists should be banging, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's one of those like people aren't born into poverty type deals, and infinite abundance doesn't make people infinitely free. It's just that I think it's pretty inarguable that if you leave aside all the problems with conspicuous consumption and the ravaging of the environment and what have you, I think the average person's life is better for the fact that for an unprecedentedly low cost, they can obtain access to any medicine or medication or a sort of like corrective, like anything they need in their life. It's easier to get their hands on than ever before, and it seems counterproductive to me to simultaneously, as a leftist, I mean, in the modern day, advocate for the lowering of prices of pharmaceuticals, like the insulin vote that in the House recently, or like making stuff more accessible to the poor, but saying like, okay, well, this is temporary. This is only because of the modern exploitative supply lines. After the revolution, all of this will become more difficult to access again because we're going to deconstruct and completely disregard all of the really complicated market-based systems that allow for these things to be as easy to access as they are now. I don't know. That seems like a pretty bad sell, especially to poor people, since historically the revolutionary proletariat have been motivated by promises of, better living standards. So to argue that actually the revolution will be followed by a period of degrowth and economic, recession, it seems, I don't know. Yeah.
It's almost an oddly conservative argument, isn't it, in some sense? Because you're almost saying that without modern capitalism as we know it, we almost have to go back to a situation where infant mortality was at some double figure percentages at some ridiculous rate, and we have to go back to not having access to all of these things. And like you said, there are some things that you can imagine we'd see less of under socialism. For fast fashion, for example, that might be an example. But generally speaking, right, we as leftists, we want to improve people's lives, and we have to think very hard about the best economic system that we want to achieve that.
So I want to talk about that with you. Actually, wait, hold on, because there are some sort of obligatory preemptive things that I say, which I should have said from the beginning. First of all, congratulations on 100,000 subs. Awesome achievement.
Yes, yeah, it was amazing. I was very, very happy with that.
Incredibly deserved. And did you, when you started, I'm sure you didn't expect, of course, to get this much, attention, but moving forward, in what ways do you intend on capitalizing on that attention now that you've sort of commanded such a large audience?
The short answer is I'm going to make a Jordan Peterson video next. I mean, I plan to do that for a while, and a lot of what he says about gender statistics, I think, is basically wrong and in need of correcting. So yeah, that I'm going to kind of but really, I'm just going to continue really doing what I've been doing. I mean, to be honest with you, I'm not while I touch on some things in current affairs, you might have noticed that I've kind of got my own little list of topics that I want to cover. You know, my most recent video, like you said, was about the toxic culture in the economics profession. And I've wanted to do that since I started my channel, since I was getting, when I'd be happy if I got 1,000 views on a video, and that one has like 100,000 views, which is just amazing to me that people are that interested in like the economics profession.
For a niche topic too. That's the thing that really, yeah, it's not even like this broad clickbait title. It's like an in-community thing, and it still did really well.
I said, you know, it's going to underperform relative to some of my other videos for sure. Most of them are on about 200,000 views. This one's probably going to peter out at like 120 or something. But that's still, you know, at or above my sub count. So I'm pretty happy with that on such a niche topic. But I think, yeah, you know, I've learned how to make videos interesting. I've learned how to make videos interesting from watching like other bread tubers, you know, having very embarrassing examples of economists in email and forum exchanges read out by Big Joel and We're in Hell, who did very good jobs of making them seem silly. I think like makes that type of video more interesting. So I think I have got better at doing that. If you watch like my first 3 videos, they're pretty dry.
I've seen all your videos. Don't worry.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's all kind of dry because it's economics, but like, I think hopefully I'll just get better at like, you know, presenting the information and trying to make it entertaining and stuff. But I mean, there's a lot of different topics I want to cover. You know, there's so many debates in economics that people talk about. There's things like the labor theory of value. People have been hassling me to do a takedown of Thomas Sowell for quite a long time, and I think I probably will. So yeah, I mean, I've just got like this plan, and I think it's still about 15 videos long, on top of other stuff that comes up. And you know, I think I may well move to doing this full time if I can like sustain it. But I just it's the thing, you know, because I have a job, an academic job,
right?
But that doesn't really excite me. Nothing I'm doing, or probably about 10 to 20% of what I'm doing in that job excites me. But every single video I make, I just find really, really interesting and exciting.
It is really difficult to compare, isn't it? You know, especially I think in an educational sense, there's really nothing quite like, you know, being large on YouTube or being a large live streamer in terms of being able to express the fundamentals of a discipline to a broader audience. You know, they talk about how if a person time traveled up to now from 200 years ago, the only thing they'd recognize would be our education system. And I think it's kind of pointed then. I mean, to be, you know, and not to disregard the academic perfection. Perfection, Jesus, didn't sleep enough. The academic profession,
by the way.
Oh, good. Okay, then fair company. You know, even the best teachers, they only get so much exposure, person to person. And most people, I think these days, for most issues, get their news and their education from social media or from television or whatever else. You know, it's very niche, like the academic fields within themselves, what people learn. And I just think this has the potential to reach far, far more people. And it's why I dislike a lot of the academic snobbiness when it comes to, you know, modern social media, because the abstemiousness there is to the detriment of the left. It's not like conservatives are like bristling in academia, you know, desperate for a chance to shine in the spotlight. People get their, you know, conservative academia from Tucker Carlson. The left is the one sort of wallowing, I think, maybe not so much in economics, but for the most part, I think wallowing in academic obscurity. So one of the reasons why I'm really heartened by your success.
Yeah, thank you. Honestly, I couldn't agree more. I think universities, you know, the way they work, you've got somebody lecturing in front of a class of disinterested students who basically just want to go on to a job in finance. And there's no proper innovation in terms of teaching methods. A lot of it's very dry. There are great teachers out there, you know, but it's coincidental, right? They're great teachers because they want to be, and they have an actual talent for it. most academics aren't trained in teaching properly. They're still doing chalk and talk in a lecture theatre, even though a lot of modern research on teaching kind of suggests that that is not a very good way to learn, especially with modern class sizes. And so it was kind of astonishing to me to see that people, 100,000 people are so engaged with a video about economics and lots of other things, and people just devote so much time to it, and they go through it and they pick through it, and they'll give you a really intelligent response in the comments. Sometimes sometimes not, but
Sometimes.
there's sometimes, but there's plenty of people out there who just, some people, I've seen people say, like, I watch all of your videos 3 times and take notes. And I was just like, I cannot imagine any of my students watching my lectures 3 times and taking notes. There's just such an appetite for knowledge, I guess, and learning out there. And it's really amazing. I never would have thought, 10 or so years ago, when YouTube was just full of funny videos of cats and stuff, I never would have thought that it would serve as a kind of alternative educational platform. But it does now. And I think academics who act snobby to it because, I don't know, YouTube can be a bit silly, right? And because things may be simplified compared to where they'd like them. I think, they're kind of, I don't like the expression, on the wrong side of history. It's a bit grandiose, but, they're fighting a losing battle, right?
Oh God,
because,
yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Because people are just moving away from it, and degrees at universities, they have instrumental value. They still have a strong institutional presence. Universities, there's no doubt about that. But how much long-term engaged learning actually takes place between their walls, I don't think it's as much as some academics would like to believe, to be honest with you.
Oh no, absolutely. And I think there's a key distinction as well between understanding a subject and practicing a subject. This might come off as remarkably naive on my part, but I feel like if you were to take your average undergrad econ student and put them up against a fastidious, interested in learning, an earnest person who just spent a couple of months looking stuff up online, and they had a good process for it. They weren't just like Googling stuff and looking at every link they found, but they had a good process for it. I think in terms of their ability to talk about the subject of economics and their ability to prescribe solutions in the real world that are useful and helpful, I genuinely feel like there's a decent chance of either of them coming out on top. In terms of their viability within economics as a profession, I would take the academic degree anytime. Kind of the same with say medical business or law as well. You can learn a lot about law from following the right podcasts or watching the right videos or reading the right court cases, but that does not make you a lawyer. The practice and the understanding, I think, is two very different levels of engagement.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the degree. Well, I mean, let me tell you, when I did my undergraduate, right, it was just after the 2008 financial crisis, which seems like basically nothing now, but actually seemed like quite a big deal at the time. And we had the Eurozone crisis, and we just didn't learn about them. There's no way of dressing that up. We didn't learn what had happened and what was happening. Greece was on fire. There were riots while we were just learning some diagrams. And what you said is absolutely right. Somebody who read a couple of books, a few blogs, maybe watched some YouTube videos, some podcasts about the financial crisis, they would have known a lot more than the average undergraduate, because what the average undergraduate is learning is a bunch of kind of technical academic skills that may be of use if you're going on to be an academic economist, but aren't really much use elsewhere, to be honest. So it is completely detached, and I do think economics is among the worst for this. But to different degrees, you could probably say it about a lot of academia. I do think that there's a tendency to teach students as if they're going to become academics, and then what they do is they learn what are actually quite high level tools and they don't necessarily engage with the world around them in an intelligible way. And what you get is that, people will ask you as an economics student, right? They might ask you, oh, what's going on in the economy? And you may well not have an answer because you haven't been learning about that. You've been learning about ISLM models, and you can draw them a diagram and, play with it a bit, but you can't actually tell people that much about what's going on in the real world. And it's just, in partial defense of academia, I think if you stick with those tools long enough, then you can hopefully attain a kind of higher level of understanding if you then go and use them to engage with the real world. But like, certainly for a lot of people, it's very easy just to stay in that silo and not actually really do what I think a lot of people would recognize as economics, not to talk about things like inequality, immigration, the digital revolution, sanctions and things like that most people would consider kind of economic news.
Oh, yeah, 100%. And there's going to be a lot of variance here as well, You're going to have this bookishness, I think, where people are more interested in the theoretical models than anything practical. I don't think you need an econ degree, for example, to track the relationship between declining union participation and lower wages for the working class. But in spite of that, I'm sure this is something discussed endlessly at the PhD level. I don't like to use the term common sense because I don't really believe in it, but at the very least, sometimes these answers seem quite evident, but they're sidelined, I think, in favor of some other points. And also, of course, the value of education can be called into question to a great extent when you consider the fact that somebody like Thomas Sowell has far more of an economics education than I do. And from what I've seen of the guy, I'm pretty sure a person who knows literally nothing about about economics would probably be able to come up with better answers to questions than him.
I think there is an
remarkable.
important sense in which, I think there is an important sense in which a certain type of economics education, and I feel like this is changing, but it has been the case for a while, can really poison your brain and basically just narrow your thought patterns and the way you think about things. So I talked about this in one of my videos called like The Death of Economics 101, where I think I actually referenced Sowell. But just thinking about economics as this very narrow set of tools that are really doctrinaire, and not being able to escape from that, not being able to think in terms of anything other than like the most basic demand and supply model, that is something that is extremely pervasive. You see it a lot, and you see it among economists, more so perhaps the older economists than the younger ones, but you do see it a lot. And then you see it kind of filter through to online through things like maybe Thomas Sowell videos. And it's just a completely wrong perception of economics. I could ramble on about it for ages, but it's just defining economics as a kind of method instead of actually thinking about, well, what's going on with wages, what's going on with GDP, what's going on with prices and things like that. It's just thinking of it as like, I've got my diagram and this is how things work, and therefore I know what's going on and you don't, leftists, and you can't have a minimum wage because that's obviously against the laws of economics.
Like, look at this graph. Do you see where these two lines meet? This is why you have to starve. It's and obviously the degree to which this is done in bad faith varies, but I feel like a lot of conservatives, especially conservative pundits, like you have Jordan Peterson and Thomas Sowell or whatever, people whose real job isn't academia. For those types, it seems like the degree is just something they have to force their way into getting, and after that, it's a legitimizer for whatever dogshit opinions they have. It reminds me of Ben Shapiro, who, of course, is Harvard Law, and he bragged later about not learning a damn thing while he was there because it's all,
I saw that actually, yeah.
Right, liberal education. And you look at that and it's like, well, in a way, this is actually one of the most honest approaches to education present there, For them, the degree is nothing more than a medal to pin on their chest. It has nothing to do with their actual opinions, They could sit there and learn about anything, any subject, and then go on to make millions of dollars every year, peddling some asinine and easily debunked, culture war bullshit that will nonetheless sell way better than whatever, whatever stuff they were taught about. Um, yeah, I don't know. It's
Yeah,
difficult
I
to,
mean,
yeah.
as somebody with a PhD, I can very confidently tell you that there are a lot of people with PhDs who have no idea what the fuck they're talking about. And that includes me on many topics, right? I mean, I like to think that when I talk about something to do with economics, I approach it with thoroughly and honestly. But, there's literally no reason. And, you can have people from within a discipline who are from kind of the wrong part of that discipline to be talking about something. You could have somebody who's like a kind of labor economist or a behavioral economist who's talking about international trade. And if they say to you, well, I've got a PhD in economics, it's like, well, actually, something like international trade is pretty complicated. So there's no guarantee that you would be right because your PhD is actually in like behavioral economics. I mean, I'm basically talking about myself in that example, to be
Oh,
honest.
no, no, right. I mean, didn't Brett Weinstein did this exact thing, right? Where he had a, I think was it a doctorate in some medical science of some kind, I think, and he was using that to pose as like a vaccine expert. He ended up getting everything wrong, of course, because he's just another dark dark intellectual, clout chaser, I think.
Mm.
But yeah, I mean, it's all very niche, in terms of its applicability. Unless you have the right attitude towards it, which I think you do, of course. Otherwise, I don't think I'd like your channel very much. It was just sort of a dry regurgitation of a very specific subfield of economic thought. Um, I wanted to talk with you a little bit about radicalism in a political and economic sense, if I may.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I get a lot. You said you're sympathetic to anarchist tendencies, and I describe
Mm.
myself the same. I get into arguments with people in the left really often because I feel like for a lot of them, the practice of engaging with or acknowledging economic complexities is a counter-revolutionary sentiment. Now I'm synthesizing here. Of course, they don't say that. They would just say like, "Oh, you're being a liberal" or whatever. But I feel like for a lot of people, anything more specific than um, after the revolution, the workers will own the means of production, so on and so forth. Building dual power, what have you. Anything like more pointed than that comes across as this kind of liberal reformism that they think is contradictory to the aims of socialist advocacy. Now, I think this is ridiculous, of course, but I want to know, what about you? Do you get this shit often?
I'll tell you what, I actually managed to swerve it, I think, so far. Probably because I'm not big enough, and maybe because the audience that I've got is kind of quite pragmatic. I think, to be honest, a fair amount of them will be thanks to your support. So thank you for that. But so they probably share some views with you. But I do encounter it from time to time, right? And I think one of the things that bothers me about this is it becomes, especially anarchism. We're really going in on the anarchists today. So I'm sorry, anarchists. I do love you,
They've had
really,
it
but
too
like.
easy for too long.
So that it just takes the form of almost complaining about any concrete suggestion, right? So you're like, let's let's take corporations, and how about if the workers voted on who runs them, and maybe if we had some other policies that encouraged, participation and various democratic mechanisms. Then they're like, oh well, you're still not getting rid of some of the hierarchies. Yeah, yeah, and it just strikes me that you can't actually propose anything that they're happy with. The only thing they're happy with is kind of vague and something along the lines of, we'll all have communities that consist of, I don't know, 150 people. That's Dunbar's number or something, isn't it? 150 people, the max that you can apparently be friends with. We'll all have communities of that, and each of them will take care of their own needs, or else they'll just kind of horizontally organize and trade like for like, but not with money, with other communities, and everything will just tick along fine. And that seems to be the kind of ideal that they're working towards. But if you propose any concrete steps to get there, because I kind of like the sound of that ideal, I'm not sure if it would actually work in practice, but I like some of the principles behind it. But everything you say about, you know, democratizing workplaces and redistributing wealth, it just seems to be met with this kind of broad, almost nihilism about anything that can be achieved. And it's not, oh, if it retains market relationships in trade in any way, then it's still ultimately just capitalism. And then, didn't you know, over the long term, that's just going to collapse back into free market capitalism and things like that. So I find essentially the whole thing decidedly unpragmatic and very, very much very woolly, really. You know, it's not concrete. I want to know if we're going to work towards a society with greater levels of equality, where everybody has access to the resources and the ability they need and the ability to fulfill their needs, where hierarchies are minimized or, you know, accountable and democratic at least. If we're going to move towards that society, like, what are the concrete steps? And I just, again, one of the reasons for starting my channel, I just don't see too much from online leftists about those things.
Yeah, I think nihilism is the right word there, you know. Because it really does seem like, you know, to a lot of them you have like three forms of government that can exist, really. Which is, you have liberal democracies, which of course they don't like, you know, capitalism.
Mhm.
You have fascist states, or like very autocratic, you know, state capitalist, whatever, however you want to pull it. And then you have sort of magic anarcho-primitivist feudalism, where you deconstruct everything that makes a modern market economy work, and you build it back up again with magic and hope. Um, which I guess is reinforced by I have these asinine conversations with people where they like distinguish between labor and work in these, like, you know, ephemeral theory-based ways. And it's like, it's at the end of the day, like, do you think people will need to work or no? And I get different answers from different people, and it doesn't feel like there's any coherence. And to me, at least, this comes across as really disappointing, because, you know, and I agree with Marx on this. I don't think people dislike contributing to their community with labor.
Mm.
I think that on a fundamental level, we are almost biologically programmed to do this, and we actually quite enjoy it, as long as the work isn't demeaning, physically destructive, and we feel like we're being rewarded with, you know, social affirmation. If it feels like it's socially valuable, I feel like for the most part, people like that, you know, maybe not 60 hours a week. I'm not saying we all have to struggle for it, but as a concept. And I can imagine a world where you have the same rough level of technological and social development that we do today. You know, you have your fancy cell phones and what have you, but communities are built around this kind of this rejection of economic alienation, where people do feel like they're acclimated and they're not alienated from their labor. And I think you can do that without like these funny numbers, like this magical economic nihilism, where you just sort of hope the theory sticks together in absence of any practical tools for applying it. And I don't know. It's like, well, how many people actually believe in the idea of abolishing economic alienation, or of workplace democracy? And how much of this is just a kind of almost like suicidal nihilism about the way the world is today, and a desperate hope for anything that's different? And the more different it feels, the better it is, you know?
It also relates to what we were talking about earlier, which is kind of being lost in academia and lost in things like theory. I think, while I did say that there was very little on YouTube about economics, what you do find is this kind of anarchist theory and Marxist theory, and it relates to the distinction between like labor and work that you were talking about. Now, there's probably, in the realms of an academic journal, you know, you can make that distinction. You can make a lot of distinctions like that between, you know, wage labor and labor that isn't for wages, between, I don't know, different types of work. That's coherent. But like you said, it doesn't mean a damn thing to somebody who has a crappy job, whose lot you could improve by saying, hey, what if you could vote your boss out? Would you do that? What if, you had some form of, higher wages or some form of income support somewhere? What if you had that, and then you maybe had a little bit more, room in terms of resources and a little bit more mental room? Those things just seem to me to be far more straightforward, pragmatic steps towards a better world, which may also eventually lead us to this mysterious hope and dream anarchist utopia. By the time we're both long gone, perhaps, I don't know. I hope so. Maybe that. I hope that could be possible. But in the meantime, let's just try and speak as plain English as possible and advocate for what I think are actually extremely common sense and pragmatic policies that give people resources and control and power over their lives.
Oh, yeah, completely agreed, And it is quite funny, I think, the people who will, in one breath, talk about how, the revolution will be led by the working class. We have to find a way to appeal to the working class. The academic elite, the bourgeois, the ivory tower types, they can't appeal to the working class. And then all of their social prescriptions are the most online Twitter takes you've ever seen in your life, where they're incapable of because these people, let's be real, these people, a lot of them are not poor and never have been. Okay, a lot of these people, this is very much a personality oriented, set of prescriptions where, I don't think they would understand that if you went up to a Rust Belt, blue collar worker or something, and tried to explain to them yeah, in the future, you'll be able to get your insulin because when you want insulin, you'll go to the insulin maker and he'll make the insulin for you. I don't think they understand how this sounds to a lot of people.
It just feeds into the worst stereotypes about the left, doesn't it? You're just a bunch of rudderless hippies who couldn't organize a piss up in a brewery, the insulin man, you could just go and walk across the camp and he'll go and sort you out. It just reminds me of these weird little camps that I went to when I was a kid, that we just full of people who are basically like this. And I think one of the other things is, apart from the fact that they don't function at all effectively because they're run on hopes and dreams, apart from that, right, one of the main things about that type of organization, I think, where you're talking about, a kind of horizontalist organization run by these lefty types, that they're absolutely full of assholes. Hierarchies, right? They're full of people who are actually in power, and yeah, they might not be called boss, right? But you get some of the worst people you'll ever meet in these types of organizations, honestly. And so I don't see that as a positive blueprint for leftism. And I think that a lot of people, members of the public, right, who maybe don't have theory brain and aren't engaged at a high level with politics.
Thank God.
They actually think that as well. They do know that, right? If you speak to, for example, I don't know, my dad, right? He will tell you that all those, and he's not a very politically engaged man, but he will tell you the exact same thing about these anarchist types and how it never really works. And there's sewage everywhere, and some absolute bellend takes control of the commune. That just seems to me to be what they're trying to rehash, and it just doesn't work for me compared to something much more sensible like having workers vote on bosses and things like that.
It's very frustrating too, for a couple of reasons. First of all, I agree about your point on them being assholes. I feel like a lot of people really just they just envision themselves being at the head of a kind of personality cult, and they don't like traditional rule-based hierarchies because that would get in the way of it. You can't really be a personality cult leader when you're the employee at a business that has a manager. But if there are no managers and there are no bosses, they just want their strong personality to sort of dominate the space. They want a social club where they have the sort of political legitimacy of a commune leader, so it's not just that they're friends, it's their friends and they're a political visionary. Because I've noticed that too as well. And with regards to this conceptualization of leftists as these stupid hippies who can't, let's you say, organize a piss up in a brewery. I think that's what you said.
Yeah, yeah. Have you ever heard that expression before?
Yeah, and I'll never quite know what it means, but I'm glad that I was able to replicate it effectively, on the spot too.
Yeah,
But
very good.
I can infer its meaning. But in terms of where that stereotype comes from, the idea of like communists as like lazy lackabouts, that is not like a very old stereotype. Like back at the beginning of the 20th century, like around the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, communists were not thought of as like, oh, they're these like idyllic hippies who like don't really know how to organize. Like they were thought of as like aggressive, politically engaged militants, which I think is a preferable stereotype in an uncertain world. And it's really only with time, I think, that this mantra got applied. You have the hippie movement in the 60s, I think, which obviously had, overlapping tendencies, or at least were perceived to, with a lot of elements of leftist politics. And nowadays, like, like I go on Twitter and I see like lefties cheering over Chaz, the autonomous zone in Seattle. Were you following that back during the BLM protests?
Yes, I followed that a little bit. Yeah.
It's like, God, like literally it was basically just a block party that lasted like a week, and also some people died, and they were like, hey, we need pizzas.
Yeah.
Like, and people were talking about it like this was the beginning of like the overthrow of the United States government. It's like, oh my God, please.
I
Please.
mean, it's funny. I recently went to Copenhagen for the first time, which is an absolutely amazing city, by the way. I would recommend it. But there is this place there which is very similar to what was it called in Seattle?
Chaz. I wish it was called
Chaz. Yeah, yeah. So it was similar. It's called Freetown Christiania. I'm not sure if that's how you say it, but that's been around for decades, right? And it is just like this place where people kind of set up a commune, and it's had clashes with the police over the years, and now they're kind of settled. And I think they do enforce police, but like weed's illegal, and there's still it still kind of runs as a sort of commune. But you go there, and your first thought is literally what you've just said and what I've just said. You're just like, this place is crap. Like it doesn't function. It's just a bunch of people who just want to smoke loads of weed. And I'm not trying to diss like smoking weed. I'm not even trying to diss the idea of like being lazy sometimes. We don't all have to work all the time.
I
Like it's
love
fine.
smoking weed and
But
being lazy.
right, exactly, right. I'm just saying, if you create these communities, these organizational forms that just clearly don't really function very well and just really smell strongly of weed, who are you going to get on board outside a very narrow sect of people?
Right. Well, it's so much of it is an aesthetic thing, right? In a communist world, there will continue to be jocks and Poindexters who like entering, statistical data into spreadsheets. There will be people who wear pocket protectors and bow ties. It's for so much like the vision of a commune or of a communist society is so tied up in the aesthetic of a revolutionary, or the aesthetic of like a modern like progressive, and any vision which exclusively includes these groups is fundamentally not a vision which includes the working class, because the working class includes everyone, people of all types. And if your vision of a better future is only appealing to people who are so like black pilled on the modern economy that they literally want to go run out into a commune in the woods, like no account for people who have children, because there's no way in fuck those people are going to get on board with whatever crazy, magical thinking shit you're engaging in. Like if you have no plan for any of that, then like don't even bother. Like just stop talking. Or I don't know, like care a little more, I guess, about the ideas before talking about them.
It's very exclusive as well, isn't it? Like, that there's often a kind of bunker mentality. And again, that has historical reasons, right? You can kind of understand where it came from. But, they're not places that are welcoming and growing, right? And they just, yeah, like you said, they just don't seem to be a great way to include just your average Joe, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad the international proletariat have representatives in you and I. At the very least, they have that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. The vanguard, yeah.
I wanted to ask, a little bit more pointedly. So
Mm.
I've watched, of course, your videos, and I know that you call yourself, or at least the doctrine that you're most aligned with, is post-Keynesianism.
Yes.
Now, I paid attention in high school. Let's just say hypothetically that I was very dumb and forgot everything about Keynesianism. Could you, because I want to get to post-Keynesianism, but I feel like there's some groundwork that I have to lay here. So would you?
Yeah. Okay, yeah.
Yeah,
So
a little bit. Yeah.
it's one of those things that's it is a bit complicated because you've got Keynesianism and then there's like neo-Keynesianism and new Keynesianism and post-Keynesianism and perhaps some other ones. And so I feel like we're doing exactly the thing that I've been criticizing, which is being very pedantic about definitions and stuff. But post-Keynesianism is good. You heard it here first. So Keynesianism essentially is the idea that their capitalist economies operate at a kind of permanently lower level than full employment. There's basically no reason for them to be at full employment, right? Because there's typically a lot of instability in investment. That can be in finance or it can be in like capital investment. When recessions happen and bubbles pop, they can become kind of self-perpetuating processes as people are laid off and they're not spending money, so businesses cut back further and lay people off, and it's a vicious cycle. So that's, for me, the basic intuition of Keynesianism, all branches of Keynesianism. But
I just want to, if I may interject very briefly, because the main thing I remember is that it was like an early 20th century economic ideology that said, actually, the government spending money to stimulate the economy is good. That's actually based in red pilled, actually.
So you that's exactly what follows from what I just said, right? So if there is a permanently low level of demand and employment is not as high as it could be, then there's scope for governments to do various things. It might be spending money fiscally. That's one of the main things that Keynesianism is associated with. Things like a lot of Biden's stimulus measures, right, would qualify as Keynesianism. It can also, depending on who you ask, include like monetary expansion, things like lowering and managing interest rates, things like quantitative easing, perhaps. So, yeah, basically the government has to intervene to keep capitalism a high level of employment. Otherwise, it will fluctuate, and generally speaking, it will be a level that is lower than full employment, and a level which leaves a lot of people essentially without work and leaves a lot of slack in the labor market, and therefore gives workers less bargaining power, right? Because there are fewer jobs to go around.
Which, and obviously, if you were an advocate for workers' rights and for workers to have high wages, you would want the government to pick up the slack and ensure a relatively higher level of employment, not only because it's possible those workers could be put to good use, New Deal, Reconstruction, whatever, but also because the more scarce unemployed workers are, the more sought after they are, which raises wages for everybody.
Absolutely, yeah. So, yeah, basic econ 101, right? The fewer workers there are, the higher wages will tend to go up. I think basically the difference. Do you want to go into the differences between post-Keynesianism and other ones?
Yeah, I want to know what problems in the world do you look at and you think like, well, I think this is a useful lens for looking into it, because after I saw your video, I tried like looking through Wikipedia, but I'll admit it's a pretty it's pretty high level stuff. I tried my best to parse through it.
Edited by just the most intense people who they're the type of people who are so immersed in theory, and then they have the Wikipedia arguments where two people who disagree with it edit it, and one person edits it and the other edits it back, and it's just so convoluted by the end that you actually can't follow it even if you have like a degree in post-Keynesian economics already. So I don't blame you for that, but I think basically this idea of full employment, for me, full employment is one of the most powerful tools that we have to advance the interests of labor. I mean, there were a lot of memes maybe about a year ago, weren't there? And some of them were real, maybe some of them not, but people basically just telling their employers to do one, right? Because their employers were treating them badly. but in the US economy, certainly there was quite a lot of job growth, and people were saying, you know what, I now have options. So you can't take the piss anymore. You can't exploit me. You know, you can't expect me to come in 5 minutes before a shift when I thought I'd be off and then threaten to fire me if I don't come for this unscheduled shift. Maybe I don't want to work in hospitality at all because it's shit. You know, all those types of things. You saw a lot of that with as employment levels grew, and that is so empowering for Labour just automatically. You know, it's every single individual worker will feel like they can ask for more and they have options. So that's one of the amazing things about full employment. And I think the key thing I would say about where post-Keynesian and new Keynesians, where they differ, is that new Keynesians will tend to say we only need government spending in a recession. When things go badly, the government has to intervene like Obama did, right? And prop up the economy, get it back going, and then you can kind of withdraw the stimulus. What a post-Keynesian would say is actually, no, this underemployment is more chronic. We need government spending during booms as well as busts. We need a kind of permanent push. And the idea of full employment can also kind of change. And we can think we're at full employment, but then don't you know, well, now we're hiring people who had previously dropped out of the labor force. Now we're hiring people who were, you know, had criminal records before. Now we're hiring people who were perhaps on disability support, but now employers.
They lowered
yeah.
in some of the
Yeah,
states.
exactly.
Yeah.
You know, all types of new people, and then, you know, that can push employment up even further. And so that's really the main thing I would say about post-Keynesianism. And there's a whole load of kind of very interesting analysis underpinning all these ideas. I think, you know, the idea that the economy can continually expand, and as it expands, people will businesses will invest more, and it's a positive virtuous circle. So that's a lot. I've gone on long enough. That was Keynesianism in a nutshell.
Not at all. And it reinforces my belief that any economic ideology that can be preceded with neo is dog shit. I had a number of questions about this. You know, because the main thing that I talk about economics wise is worker democracy. Thanks for your video, by the way. Phenomenal video.
I'm glad you liked it.
And very, very basic, like 101, you know, workers good, bourgeois bad type stuff. You know, I try to stay in my lane with this. I know more about worker democracy, I think, than a decent, like, I can win debates with it. But the broader econ stuff is always a bit more, I just like it when the government spends money. It just makes me happy, you know. One of the things that I was taught growing up was that supplementing unemployment, or sorry, like bolstering employment through government work programs and government spending doesn't count. Because the government, if it wanted to, because it's not a for-profit entity the way that a corporation is, they could employ any number of people. And historically, we've seen stuff like this in the Soviet Union, where to keep their full employment thing going, because that's kind of one of their big political prescriptions, like every person has a job, they'll have people do worthless jobs. They'll hire people to literally just sit in a factory doing nothing, supervising nothing, producing nothing. And while I acknowledge that can be an issue, I do not think it's fundamentally a problem for a couple of reasons. First of all, you know, take the public works projects during the New Deal. You know, if the government hires people to, say, patch up roads or build cool stuff, those are roads that are being patched and cool things that are being built. Like that, like there is worth being generated through this employment, you know, outside of any abstract economic consideration. And second of all, like you've explained, it has a positive effect, a pro-worker effect on the labor market broadly. Do you like the idea of having a kind of worker core, you know, like maybe after college or as an alternative to college, like as a kind of, I don't know, state subsidized trade school type deal? Here's your like basic construction education. Here's your basic, like, you know, infrastructural you know, like training course, like let's go out there and let's make our roads less shitty. Like does that sound like unfeasible? Is there a problem with that?
I think economically, I would say no. I mean, I don't. This kind of assumption, and it is just an assumption, and it's the same as the assumption that capitalism would be at full employment. The assumption that the government can't add to the net resources of society, that it can't engage in productive investment, is just completely unfounded. I mean, obviously, the government can build things like hospitals, the government can invest in education, it can invest in infrastructure. There are lots of things governments can do, and that they do, which are net positives for the economy, as well as, like you said, not just the economy in abstract, but also, health outcomes and education outcomes and, infrastructure outcomes, however defined. So it just strikes me as completely ridiculous to pretend that the government can't contribute. In terms of the specific work program, I go back on this. I mean, a lot of modern monetary theorists, which I'm guessing is a term you've heard a fair amount as well.
Only
modern
from
monetary
annoying
theory. I'm not going to disagree with that. So yeah, they talk about a job guarantee, right? And having the state basically bring people into work and guarantee people jobs. Now, the one doubt I have about this, and I go back and forth on it, is I'm not. This is where my anarchist side comes out, and I think I'm not so sure about the political economy of the state granting everybody jobs. I feel like it might just be another way for the state to treat poor people like shit and make them do really bad jobs. And that is why I have a doubt about it. So my doubt about it is really political rather than economic as such. I mean, I don't know if that correctly characterizes what you were talking about, but that would be my main misgiving.
No, I completely agree. Yeah. I guess the last thing that you would want is for it to turn into a kind of, like woke, spend 4 years in the army to get a free college education type deal, where you have like poor people effectively being like economically coerced into it because it's the best option they have, and it doesn't cost money like college does. I wonder if there's a way to implement that properly. There has to be. I'm sure that with the right tweaking and incentive structure, you could get like a healthy, productive version of that system.
I mean, this is where you work with
takes some
entities
finagling.
like unions, right? This is where you try and make it more of a ground up thing than just a state implemented thing, and you would hope to engage local governments, right, and unions and various other organizations in civil society, which is something that I think is really important for the left, because that's where the right, they have a point sometimes about the violence that the state commits and about how arbitrary the state can be. And again, what you see some leftists do is go, oh, yeah, well, no, actually, the state's great and we want central planning, and just completely take the wrong lesson instead of trying to harness the argument against the state for their own terms, which is obviously also a leftist argument with a long history. So, yeah, I think what you want to do is try and, if you can think about some kind of training program, try and make it more ground up rather than more top down, right?
Right. I mean, the big benefit of a program like that, the central benefit, I think, would be being able to circumvent market systems. No longer does it matter if something is profitable. You don't need to bid for it. The state's paying the bill, But that doesn't overcome other adjacent issues, Like, I still support unions even for like federal agencies. I don't think that working for the government means you should suddenly have to cede your workers' rights. The idea of like funded federally, state operated, mandatory union in every one. Yeah, I'm sure there's a way. It's just something I dream of. I don't know what the state of the roads are like over there in across the Atlantic, but over here in America, you can drive through L.A. and it's every nanosecond you drive through like about $1 billion of retail worth on your left and right hand sides respectively, over a pothole. To your left, it's a Porsche dealership. To your right, it's a famous dentist who celebrities brag about attending. And underneath you is 2 feet of empty space where asphalt should be. It's an absolute nightmare. So I fantasize about something happening, something being done about that.
Yeah, I think it does. From what I've seen, I mean, when people sometimes say crumbling infrastructure, I think in the USA that doesn't actually seem to be rhetoric. That actually seems to be what's happening.
Yeah,
Like the
literal
bridges are
description.
literally, yeah, like they're actually, slowly eroding over time. So I think in the UK, we could definitely do more. And again, in the poorer areas, the potholes and the roads are much worse. But I don't think we've quite reached the stage, because I think you guys, you do have that, like, somebody says, let's fix these roads that are literally going to endanger people's lives because they're so bad, and of course you're labeled a communist, right?
Well, they literally shot down Biden's the Build Back Better. Like there were Republicans calling it like woke or whatever.
Oh,
It's just yeah, it's impossible to do anything here. This country's doomed. Not by the way, yours is doing that much better. I know in London, the road quality can vary based on the what do they have? The borough? It's the borough, right?
yeah.
Yeah. That there's like some autonomy in terms of local maintenance, which is interesting. That's not even like city delegation. That's like sub city. We don't have an equivalent of that and anywhere here in the States. It's just funny to think about.
Yeah, London is, I mean, I live in London, and it is quite remarkable how you can literally cross a road and go from like the richest area to the poorest area. And it happens very suddenly, and you actually don't notice until you look around you, like, oh my God, I'm actually in, like, an area with 5 times less the average income than I was just a second ago. So there's a lot of regional inequality in the UK in general, but even within, especially London, other cities as well, but especially London, it's really, really bad. I mean, it's interesting because I do think regional inequality it's kind of my go-to example for why inequality is bad, because what you get with regional inequality is people just born into different worlds, right?
Oh, yeah.
People, you can be born a few streets down, and you're just born into, completely different set of circumstances, completely different access to resources, different schools, different hospitals, different roads, right? And there is just no reason why that is fair.
In Los Angeles, it's the highways. The highways divide. We don't have boroughs in Los Angeles, but they'll divide. Like on one side of the highway, you'll have like an upper middle class residential area right next to a shopping district, and on the other side of that highway, literally just like a 100-foot underpass, that you have to walk through. All of a sudden, it's chain link fences surrounding dirty lawns with like deconstructed cars on them. Um, yeah, it's pretty remarkable. We don't even have the difference in boroughs. It's just redlining over here. We don't even have the
Mm.
excuse of having different budgets for different areas. The budget applies equally to both of those sides of the freeway. It's the exact same pool of money. One of them just has more black people. So I can't judge too hard considering
Both
where I came
horrifying in
from.
their own ways, I think, is the correct conclusion.
Yeah. Well, whatever the case may be. Well, these things right here. I mean, this is the importance of a field, right? Um, abstract theory based, and by theory I mean political theory, not economic theory. Political theory based answers don't really have a solution to these, more intricate problems. I mean, how could you possibly address regional inequality? Like, what if one area's shoemaker is better than the other area's shoemaker? Like
Yeah.
this stuff takes a lot of thought and consideration. It's why I'm really happy that you're not like what would you call it, like a pop channel, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
you're not like cool econ for kids, like I think you take the
What
subject
you mean, like
seriously.
Economics Explained? Have you ever watched that channel?
Yeah, I think we've even looked at it on stream. Yeah, I remember they had something on inflation that I was looking at, and even I thought there were Oh, I wanted to ask you about that, by the way.
Hmm.
Inflation, good or bad? Give us the hot take.
Inflation. Well, the answer is that it depends. I mean, I certainly think that we've had kind of 2% inflation targets for a long time, and I do think that that's too low. I think that, like I said, right, as a good post Keynesian, I think that the level of inflation we can tolerate is a bit higher, especially uh, enables higher employment. What I will say is that the current inflation at the moment, which is obviously affecting people's cost of living by quite a lot, is a bad thing, right? The rise in price of energy, right, for example, and the rise in price of specific goods and sectors, things like I think microchips have been really expensive and hard to come by. That type of inflation is definitely bad for the average person, especially when it's experienced as wages aren't rising but prices are. So I think it really depends. We can tolerate more inflation in general, but the inflation that's been brought on by the pandemic and lockdown measures is definitely something that is currently, I would say, one of the biggest issues in the UK is the cost of living, and a lot of people are really struggling with it. And so, yeah, I mean, it's at the moment, I would say overall it's bad. I would tend to disagree with a lot of mainstream economists over what we should do to fight it. But I suppose that's another issue.
All right, because as I understand it, and I'm happy to be corrected here, but inflation is magic, and if it happens, it happens. I'll admit the processes by which you control it are. I understand, that the reserve can change its interest rates to like affect like borrowing, and that can affect like the availability of, or like the liquidity of, oh god. I know there are things that people can do,
Hmm.
but this seems to be like a global thing at the moment, the inflation. So I don't know how much domestic
Yeah.
policies are really the cause or solution to it, you know?
No, I mean, I think what you've seen for a long time is that we've the way we've managed inflation is like as you said, through interest rate management, and basically increasing interest rates can kind of uh, reduce business investment. It also reduces households' disposable income. A lot of that comes through like mortgages and maybe some of it through other loans. But if you have like variable rate mortgages, people are going to pay more when the base rate goes up, right? So you have reducing household disposable income. And that just generally reduces the level of demand in the economy. And so you get people buying less stuff. And you get businesses hiring fewer people, and it just basically dampens the economy as a whole. And that's been the prevailing way to manage inflation. But I think one of the big things which you also hinted at, one of the big things which the pandemic is showing is that when we talk about inflation, we talk about a kind of aggregate, consumer price index measure, and you get a kind of hopefully a representative basket of goods, and you look at the average price change. But actually, that hides some really big differences between different goods and services. So if you look at, like, if you take the US, right, healthcare and education costs have gone up hugely,
Uh-huh.
right?
Yeah.
Housing costs, I can't remember, but I'm pretty sure they've gone up quite a lot over the past few decades.
Would you agree
Yeah,
with me that
yeah.
excluding medical, housing, and education costs from our calculation of inflation is a kind of class warfare? Because the way these prices ramp up like really disproportionately affect. I mean, all of them do. Inflation's always going to be a poor person like problem for the most part. Basket of groceries. But like, what? How can you calculate inflation without considering the way housing prices have gone up? Like, clearly that's a factor in a lot of people's economic realities.
So are they excluded in the USA? I mean, I work with the UK inflation data sometimes, and they are in there. The price, it's a little bit, it's a bit more complicated in the UK because it's much more state funded health and education. But is it the case that they're excluded in the US inflation data?
My impression is that they are, from what I've heard. I could be wrong on that. At the very least, I'm very confident that medical and education costs are not factored in.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I'd have to double check because I mean, yeah, that does sound ridiculous because you're just biasing the conclusion, right? You're biasing the inflation measure downwards. And there's also, even if you do include them, there's the question of like how they're included, because you can always play with it and get a lower inflation measure if you use certain measures or you
Fiddle
use
the
certain methods of
Yeah, yeah.
calculating it. And I think a lot of the time, I mean, one of the things that's come out of the inflation literature over very recently, actually, over the past decade, is that the way that we calculate inflation really underestimates the inflation rates for the poor. The price indexes, the amount that prices are rising, typically higher for poorer people, and so that gets lost, and lower for richer people, being the corollary of that. So that gets lost when you're talking about average inflation, which is like, and then like I said, the solution is, well, inflation's going up. Let's increase these people's mortgage costs and have them cut back on their spending. And I think you're right to call it class warfare, to be honest, because you are just making a certain group of people bear the brunt of inflation. And you're not looking at kind of multifaceted, pragmatic ways. Okay, inflation's really high in the healthcare sector. Prices are really high in the healthcare sector. What do we do about that? Maybe we can take a multi-pronged approach to inflation. I'll have to look into the US's inflation statistics, because if that's true, then that is ridiculous.
Yeah, I don't want to misrepresent. I'm no expert on this, obviously. It's one of those things where it seems like this is very easy to qualitatively describe and very difficult to quantitatively describe, where if you want to understand the numbers associated with poverty, you're doing like PhD math to try to work it out. And if you want to understand the experience of poverty, you can just talk to like a poor person and get a pretty good feel. Like, they'll tell you, right? I'm sure there has to be some method of understanding inflation rates that are a little more, I guess, inclusive towards experiential differences, but I'm sure that's some very complicated shit that I wouldn't.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I'm a big advocate of economists and other social scientists and everybody who is relatively well off and engaged with politics, actually talking to people, because I think that you can always get some insights. And it goes back to some of the snobbery we were talking about, right? I think there are some academics out there who just say, well, our statistics come out the way they do, and we've calculated them correctly, and inflation is 2.5%. So I don't care what this person says, because their experience is just like an anecdote. It doesn't actually mean anything. And you've got to be careful when just interpreting what people say, but also that doesn't mean that you never speak to anyone. When you do that kind of research, you can get a lot of information. I mean, there was a viral thread in the UK where a guy was just looking at, I think he's like an activist, and he was saying, look, the price of like smart price pasta, which is like our lowest price pasta, and all the smart price goods, which are basically the cheapest you can get. I know how much they've gone up because I've recorded it, right? And they've gone up by much more than the inflation rates that we see tell us. And so you've got to look at that and say, he has a point. There's actually something going on there. Maybe there's something that the inflation measures are missing. And it's just part of a broader trend, right, where statistics kind of triumph, and academics don't really engage with the more mucky qualitative research. And I think just statistics, I mean, one of the things that I try to emphasize on my channel is that statistics, they do need context. They really do, because you can't really understand what's going on unless you understand the context the statistics have come from.
No, I completely agree. You talked about this in your brilliant video on Plinkett. Oh, wait, is it Plinkett? Optimism. No,
so Plinkett's the Red Letter Media guy.
That's right.
The Star Wars
Pinker. Yeah,
Stephen
yeah.
Pinker, yeah.
To my knowledge, I didn't get the impression that Plinkett was a particularly optimistic guy from the videos that I've watched. But yeah, no, yeah, Stephen Pinker. Yeah, thank you. Where depending on the methods used, oftentimes statisticians with a political bias it's kind of like the statistics version of p-hacking, right? Where you have a desired conclusion. In his case, it's to indicate the world has gotten better, and depending on the methodology you use, you can find that like no matter what. Like, if you're sufficiently educated on statistical methods, there's almost no conclusion you can't arrive at if you know how to weigh everything beforehand. Which is why I guess yeah, I don't know. It seems like the advocacy for information and the collection of information, for me, they have to be two like almost completely separate fields. Because if I just see a bunch of like research studies on data acquisition methods and statistical truth and all that, what I imagine is that they're made by gigantic nerds who are nerds and huge nerds, and they just like collecting data and they love numbers. Can they have a bias? Sure, but maybe they just like numbers. And then political advocates will take that information and sell it to promote an agenda, which is exactly what I do. But when you have people who have an explicit political agenda also collecting the data, well, it reminds me of all the research I did on black IQ, a ton of the stuff in the bell curve to, this racial group, blah, blah, blah. A ton of the research done on racial IQ differences were made by people who were basically clan members who would go over to like, darkest Africa and find like 3 random kids and go like, hey, here's like a trig test, good luck, and then like write them down for 4 IQ and go back home and write like a 60-page paper on like the the how the Angloid skull is superior or whatever, like just some completely made up bullshit. But it just reminds me this like phony scientific, and I'm not saying that Pinker like puts his thumb on the scale that much. I'm only saying that like I guess I'm suspicious because those two roles, their job contradicts each other, sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think Pinker puts his thumb on the scale in that sense, because I don't think he really understands the statistics he's representing enough to be able to. But the history of statistics, it's a deep rabbit hole, right? When you get into it, like a lot of statistical methods were literally invented to look at racial differences in IQ, and there's a whole history of statistics and how intertwined they are with like the emergence of states and the power of authoritarian states. And a lot of it also came from gambling, right? And so there's this very suspicious history, I think, of statistics. Now, that doesn't mean we reject statistics outright, but it does mean that we need to realize that they come from somewhere and they have biases. I mean, one of the things about the poverty data that always surprises me, like every time I say it, and I check the research that told me this multiple times because I still don't really believe it, is that if you take like the poverty data, the majority of countries don't actually have any.
Yeah,
right.
A lot of countries out there,
So they don't. Of course, they don't have any, because statistical institutions, gathering statistics is not easy, right? We devote millions and millions and millions of pounds to it in richer countries. It's really difficult to have that kind of data on people's earnings.
You need a census, and you need to send people out to gather that and like double check. It's like a whole procedural. It's like canvassing is tough, and you're doing this for a whole country.
I mean, you're self-employed, right? I'm guessing, right? Calculating your income can be actually very, very difficult. It can be difficult to know what your income really is. If you're like in a village in India or something, and you've got perhaps a lot of non-monetary goods, converting that into like not just like rupees, but like dollars, converting all of your ingoings and outgoings into just like one metric can be extremely difficult. And oftentimes it's just not done, or like close estimates are used, and it's just astonishing how much of the data is missing. I mean, I will say that population adjusted, the representation of the world is better than half, but like there are so many countries and so many people within countries who aren't represented by these statistics. And of course, the correct conclusion isn't to say, well, they all must be in absolute poverty and everything's going wrong for them, and therefore Steven Pinker is definitely wrong. The conclusion is just to say there's a lot of uncertainty around these things. We can't just present one graph of a line going down and say that it's and be triumphalist about it, because we don't know enough. And that's the problem with how these statistics are used in the political arena, right? You see people like Bill Gates, Max Rosa, Steven Pinker, they'll kind of share these charts and they'll be like, look, poverty has declined, and there's just no mention of the uncertainty surrounding it and the choices that have been made in that data gathering. And it's just a really bad way to use statistics. I mean, it's one of the reasons that what I try to do on my channel is when I'm using a piece of research or a piece of data, I will try to explain it and where it's come from, so that people can be like, oh, well, this didn't just fall from the sky. This has some limitations. There are certainly things about the poverty data that I think are encouraging. I think it's difficult to deny, for example, that China has seen a massive reduction in material poverty. In fact, it would be outright ridiculous to deny that. Right. So there are positive things we can say about it, but we just need to be a bit more humble and not use statistics, to kind of beat the other side over the head with and pretend that we've got them behind us. I mean, that's what like people like Ben Shapiro do, doesn't they? Like he's got all the statistics behind him, but when you look into it, they're just extremely biased.
But they fall apart. It's the gap between the data collection and the conclusions derived. I'm generally suspicious of anyone who uses statistical data to promote the cause of optimism. I don't like optimism as like a political goal. I debated Charlie Kirk a little while ago, and he told me the purpose of education should be instilling gratitude in students. To me, it's always, be thankful for what you have. Well, no, not really, right? Like history gets improved by people who aren't like complacent, people who aren't blearily optimistic about the world as it is now. And it seems like sometimes it's just a way of quieting people down. What did they say to Black Lives Matter protesters? Well, hey, we live in a time of unprecedented racial equality, so why are you so mad? What did they say to the feminists? What do they say to queer people today? They say this every time. Poor people, well, the GDP is higher. Always optimism. It's never just in its own context, because if you want to be optimistic about it, you can, but the implicit, the implied statement after is things are so good right now, why don't you simmer down? And I think the same is the case for Pinker as well. He's not like a Charlie Kirk like proto-fash or whatever. He's not like I think in his case it might be a kind of like liberal technocratic, hum and dance and smile along type deal, not so much shut up plaques type deal. But actually funny to think of it, Thomas Sowell did the same thing as well. Didn't he like protest? He said that like sit-in students who during the civil rights protests like had nothing to complain about way back in the 60s.
Did he say that?
I believe so.
Wow.
Yeah, I think I read that he was that it was during the civil rights movement, and he was let's see if I can confirm that, because I've said that a couple of times and I'm pretty sure I read that on stream the first time. But yeah, he's got some interesting takes on the subject. Anyway, yeah, optimism as a political prescription is not something that I have a lot of respect for.
What true optimism is really what leftism is about, right? Because it's about thinking that human flourishing can go so much further than what we have right now. And that requires critiquing the existing system. So for me, that is optimism. For us to, envision a society where there is no poverty and, where democracy has been extended to various spheres and, people have much more control over their lives and things like this, right? To envision that type of society is optimistic about what humanity can achieve. It's perhaps you could say pessimistic about what the existing system can achieve. But like you said, pessimism about what exists, about the status quo, is often how progress is made. And I think one of the kind of tensions, I wouldn't call it a contradiction, but the tensions in Pinker's book is that he acts like he's very pro problem solving, pro science, pro changing things in some ways, but the problem solving can't extend to the existing system. You can't say inequality is bad, for example, right? That's not allowed. It's just that when you're problem solving, you're, I don't know, working at a university trying to create a new energy source. That might be okay. Trying to get investment from a venture capital firm for your new energy source, that might be okay. But if you start to question, hey, maybe our fossil fuel subsidies are a terrible thing, and our economy is geared in a way that actually prevents renewable energy expanding. If you start to ask those kind of more fundamental questions, then Pinker's out, right? That doesn't count as problem solving anymore.
No. Yeah, I fully agree. Um, well, it's not really about solving problems, right? I mean, it's the opposite. It's the end of history mentality with a lot of liberals. It's the problems don't even really exist. Or if they do exist, they will be inexorably and inevitably solved by exactly the same processes that we already have with no need for alteration. Everything is fine. The road we're on is fine. By the way, I looked to clarify, and it wasn't during the civil rights protest. It was 5 years after. Black
Ah,
students were protesting because a cross had been burned on the lawn of the black women's dormitory, and which led to racial protests and eventually a sit-in in one of the buildings. And 30 years later, Sowell wrote on the event saying, quote, let me get the quote. It's and noted, it so happened the pervasive racism that black students supposedly encountered at every turn on campus and in town was not apparent to me during the 4 years I taught at Cornell and lived in Ithaca. And that was after the cross was burned on the black women's dormitory lawn. So, it's anyway, I just want to clarify, not during the civil rights protest. Still an interesting perspective to take on the issue, sorry, I just wanted to clarify so nobody can accuse me of lying.
yeah, fair enough. Yeah, burning crosses, no biggie, no biggie.
Did they do that in the UK, by the way? Is that just like an America plan thing, or is that like a broader white-black racial relations sort of Western tradition?
My inclination, and I stress, like I said earlier, I don't necessarily know what I'm talking about more than anyone else with this. My inclination is that that was a very specific US gesture, I
And
think.
they say white people have no culture.
Yeah.
I wanted to add, and by the way, I've taken up quite a lot of your time here. You're a lot busier than I am. So I don't want to keep you forever, but I'm having a tremendously good time. I wanted
No,
to ask something.
I'm absolutely fine with continuing for a bit. It's 8:30 here, so
Okay.
yeah, I'm fine.
Well, I do appreciate it quite a lot. I wanted to
Appreciate
talk.
being invited on.
You're happy to come on again in the future.
Of course.
Decommodification. So the market socialist economic stuff, I feel like I have a good grasp on it. So, decommodification, obviously it's something we already see a bit of, even here in the States. We have the Postal Service, which is functionally decommodified, a few other services, other countries have more. You have your NHS, which for now is at least partially decommodified,
Yeah.
so for the time being, which is good. So how do you feel about decommodification as a concept, and where are the lines where that can be drawn? Because I'm a big advocate for decommodification, in theory, applied to anything for which there is an absolute and unconditional need, of course, because then you have, like people, they'd be willing to pay any amount for it. It's, what's the term for that? When the demand is,
It's called lexicographic preferences. Is that what you mean?
wow,
Or
I
is, you
have
think
never
of something
heard
else?
that term before. But
Okay.
I'll assume inelastic demand.
Okay, yeah, no, that's perfectly inelastic. Yeah, is lexicographic. That's the same thing. Yeah.
Okay, well that sounds way fancier. I'll try to incorporate that.
Yeah. Try to remember that. You'll sound
Win a few
smart.
debates in the future. Stuff like housing, medical care, maybe even food production and distribution, though that would be a bit more finicky, I think, because you'd have to have like parallel, it'd be like a food stamps type deal or something like that. How do you feel? What's the role for decommodification? Is it something you particularly value? Do you think the data works in its favor in some cases, or?
Yeah, I think that, having state provision in one way or another of basic needs is absolutely an essential part of socialism. And I think you really took the words out of my mouth, right? Because it is for things that people need. That's where you draw the line, right? But I do think there's also a case that you can be kind of pragmatic. I mean, in one of my examples, in my videos, the one on housing that was a response to Philosophy Tube, I talked a little bit about how, despite obvious problems like inequalities and environmental issues, the market for a lot of foods tends to function better than the market for, say, healthcare. Right, the market for healthcare is just filled with all sorts of massive failures. Whereas foods, a lot of them are kind of provided and are quite readily available. What you, of course, need there is, as you hinted at, redistribution. Right, so you need people to have the money in order to buy those foods. That's one thing that markets don't do very well. It's not necessarily the case that everybody has access. So for me, I mean, I don't know if a strict Marxist, no, in fact, I can say a strict Marxist would not classify that as decommodification, because you still have a kind of market for food. But for me, that's kind of alleviating people's dependence on the market and allowing them to access their basic needs. That is exactly what I would want. And in plenty of other situations, you would perhaps have much more direct state involvement, or, some combination of states and local governments and, democratic mechanisms, worker democracies delivering these things. So as long as people have access to them, many of them may be free at the point of use. Many of them may be provided for through redistribution that's kind of prior to the exchange. But as long as everybody has access to all of these things, I can be pragmatic, and I am undecided in many cases about exactly how they're produced and delivered. So gotcha. I hope that answers your question, but I don't think a Marxist would be very happy with that answer, because for them, decommodification, again, goes back to what we were saying earlier, is more like kind of abolishing markets altogether, and getting rid of all market transactions in goods, because that's commodification. And there's a kind of a social, or you might even call it like a spiritual critique of commodifying things in there, but I have to be honest, like, that's not something that I know that much about.
Well, for me, I mean, look, at the end of the day, we just do not have any reliable data on the idea that central planning or any other kind of non-market planning broadly can produce the same life outcomes. I feel like the best thing we can do right now is take a look at what theoretical advantages would be provided by a fully decommodified economy, and try to find ways to incorporate those while making changes to our market economy that are in line with what we understand to be like effective and pragmatic and realistic changes. So like maybe we can't, like fully. So food, for example, at least with food, you can shop around for food. You can't do that with medical or housing stuff quite as much, for a variety of reasons due to the abstractions inherent to both of those markets. Yeah, maybe more aggressive decommodification would be applicable there. Government housing or house construction programs. Obviously, Bernie fan, Medicare for all over here. That sounds good to me. In terms of decommodification broadly, it's nice to think about, but I don't. Yeah, I don't know. It just seems like it seems like we should be concerned primarily with why we would want decommodification and work towards those things, because decommodification is not meant to be a solution in and of itself. It's not good in and of itself. Not, I think, even to a Marxist. It's good because it achieves certain things, economic and political goals, a reduction of alienation, the abolition of the commodity form, These are things which I think you can pursue without tying your solutions like directly to this very abstract political goal. And it's like a non-essentialist political perspective. You do what works, you do what you can.
Yeah, I think I completely agree with you on houses. That is one of my opinions on the housing market, is just like, have the government build more houses, right? It's actually not everything has to be super clever and complicated. There are people who lack housing, whose housing is too expensive, is not good enough quality, is not in the right place. Build houses, right? It's pretty simple, to be honest with you. So that's one thing that I definitely agree with. I mean, in terms of the more abstract idea of commodification, I think one area where I can see the Marxist critique making sense. And I stress that I'm really kind of out of my depth here. But when you talk about things like dating apps, right?
Yeah.
And there's a kind of Marxist critique of those, that they're turning dating into a kind of something like a job application, and they're commodifying it and they're packaging it, and they're really taking all the good out of the human relation, that would you know 20, 30 years ago have been a key part of like finding a partner. And I think I do get that. I feel like I do get that. Maybe I can't articulate it as well as some people, but I feel like that's a kind of sensible critique of commodification. And people might talk about like organ markets and how they would lead to bad outcomes because you shouldn't commodify organs, right? And so there are things like that where I think that the leftist critique of commodification has some bite. But in terms of providing for essential needs, I'd just be much more straightforward and pragmatic about it, and just say, look, whatever we can do to get houses and food and healthcare to people, even if it involves markets in some sense, I think we should do.
Oh yeah. No, I fully I have a cough this morning. No, I fully agree. Yeah, it seems like if anything, the consequences of alienation are most severely felt on the consumer side for experiences and not so much for products themselves, you know. Whatever process allows people to buy food as cheaply as possible is, as far as I'm concerned, a good process. People should be able to get food as cheaply as possible. You know, I don't want to go back 400 years where the average person ate nothing but bread and soup, and they would like hunt for game and like stew the bones in to make broth, you know, like to get every calorie they could. Like, I'm glad people don't have to do that anymore. At least, you know, not here, not most of us. But in terms of experiential stuff, dating apps would be a good example. I think the consumption of art broadly, you know, because right now art is commercialized to the point that it is exclusively product driven, you know, and obviously it's difficult, I think, right now to conceptualize of this being anything else, because it's kind of difficult to imagine outside of that paradigm what something might be like. But it seems like there's sort of a limitation placed on form. It's really difficult to experiment with movie lengths or television show formats when everything is streamlined into this multi-billion-dollar, highly commercial, you know. It's one of the things the internet was great for, right? Like, you can do whatever you want when you're uploading your own videos. You know, YouTube is like a something that's allowed a bunch of people to experiment with new formats or types of content. It's led to a lot of people, like, funnily enough, like people disillusioned with animation or with the industry in general, doing stuff online for their own artistic fulfillment. That gets really successful, and then they get brought back on board in mainstream industry to do that, but to a larger audience with a higher budget. And you know, it's kind of like a test bed almost for different forms of commercially viable products, which is, I don't know, that can be cool, I think.
Yeah, it can be. It's part of like, sometimes capitalism does create spaces where you can hopefully create alternatives to capitalism, right? And maybe the internet could be one of those. I mean,
How nice of them.
I do
Yeah.
worry that it's kind of going the other way, and that kind of the firms of kind of are winning in terms of open source versus like commercialized content on the internet. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess we'll see. You know, YouTube is getting more corporate for a while now, so you know, we'll see if that pans out. Anyway, I I could feel my cough acting up, which is actually really irritating. I should probably abate stream earlier than I intended to. I would like to talk with you in the future. I think about more specific economic stuff as well. When problems crop up, I want your perspective because again, there are very few econ voices in the online left space, and one of my one of my biggest frustrations. I mean, I've already talked to you. We both agree, I think, on the sort of impracticality of a lot of prescriptions given by the online left, but also more specifically, it feels like even when specific solutions are given, they're kind of limited to the sort of stuff that I can do. You know, like very basic, like social democrat-esque, like government spending good, austerity bad, worker ownership in unions good, not bad. The more detailed stuff is well beyond me. Anyway, yeah, I really, really appreciate you coming on, and I would like to keep in touch for future talks if possible.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been great fun speaking to you as I expected it would, and I'm absolutely happy to come on to talk about some of the nitty gritty details in the future and anything that comes up in the news.
Absolutely. Well, you need no introduction or closure, I suppose, but still, everyone, Unlearning Economics really is a phenomenal channel. So I strongly suggest you take a look at it, even if you're not a big fan of economics as a field. Also, to my mind, your video on worker ownership is literally the best existing piece of media on the subject, balancing thoroughness and accessibility. I really don't think anything else comes close.
Wow, that's some praise indeed. Thanks very much.
And I do like talking about it. Have a wonderful day or night. I'll talk to you soon, and good luck with the videos that's coming out soon. Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks very much, mate. Yeah, you have a good day.
Be well. Yeah, I really really like that guy. Just so you know where we stand on him, even if somehow the bridge gets torched, and I don't know how that would happen, but even if it did, like, I honestly think in terms of the viability of his content, like its worthwhileness, up there with ContraPoints. Really, really do. Like, I mean, if you like, I would recommend this guy to hell and back, regardless of any bullshit. Really, really phenomenal stuff. I just want to reiterate this. Like, I've said this a million times before, but there is no such thing as a gigantic immediate paradigm shift. It has never happened basically in all of human history. Everything always is built on top of what came before it. After the Bolshevik Revolution, like, all of the economic and political structures they had were built up from what already existed. They didn't just invent, like, just some new thing, After the American Revolution, guys, you know how America has, like, common law? British common law? After the American Revolution, we had judges and lawyers and citizens here in the former British colonies, now the United States of America. They couldn't just invent a new legal system. They were like, okay, well, we'll add the Constitution and we'll make our own laws now, but, like, in the meantime, here's British common law and we'll use what we know. Everything is built atop of what came before it. Nothing is made without precedent. And the reason I'm saying this is because a lot of lefties treat leftist economics as though it will. They have no interest whatsoever in the system as it exists now, or how to get what exists now to where they want it to be. And that's really, really bad, Basically, like, lefties are like construction workers who are not, like, who are building a building in the Gaza Strip on top of the ruins of another building, and they neither are interested in clearing it out nor know how to. So they're going over there with all the tools to build a new building, and, like, there's like 4 stories of steel girders and rubble, and they're just like building, they're like lining up bricks on top of a 45-degree angled slab of concrete. They're like, why won't it stand up? Like, they just don't engage with it. They pretend it's not there, which is really, 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 really dumb. You need to be able to do that. So my only suggestions broadly on economics are this, okay? First of all, respect the field. It's a social science. Just because conservatives draw dumb conclusions from it doesn't mean it's not real. Like, they do the same thing with criminology, sociology, and history. Would you ignore all those things because conservatives draw dumb conclusions? It's not like, it's kind of our fault we ceded ground to them in the economics field, a little bit. That's one. For two, don't care about leftist, like, solutions. Care about the problems that you want to solve, and then find the solutions that work best for that, okay? Most of the economic literature that lefties cite comes from 150 years ago, okay? If Marx could see, like, if you could explain what an NFT to Marx was, he would shoot himself in the head. Like, our world is unfathomable to him. He's a brilliant guy, don't get me wrong. A lot of what he wrote is super relevant today. I'm not saying it's outdated. I'm only saying that what you should be concerned with first and foremost isn't the solutions that he applied or would have applied, but rather what problems did he identify and what logic was he using to prescribe those solutions in reference to those problems. Because maybe the logic can be the same, but the end state of things, the solution, will change because the world is different now. You see? You know what I mean? It's like Sun Tzu, you know, the warrior writer, like the warrior philosopher, right? Like, imagine like Sun Tzu is writing like, you must pretend to be strong where you are weak and pretend to be weak where you are strong. And that's Sun Tzu? Is it Tzu? Sun Tzu. Okay. Like that's good advice, right? You know, like you have to confuse the enemy as to your strength. Like, know your enemy. Yeah, great ideas, okay? Now imagine you're reading like a passage from Sun Tzu, and he's like, put the guys with the spears in front so they can stab the horses. And you're like, well, this guy's supposed to be like a good... Okay, it's Tzu, thank you. So this guy's supposed to be like a warrior philosopher guy, so let's do it then. And you go out there into like Ukraine with like your phalanx of spearmen in front of the guys with like the AK-47s or whatever. Like, you understand the logic, but recognize that logic, even if it maintains a consistency, can change with regards to the solutions that it leads to. So just keep that in mind, please. Yeah, I only ask for that, you know, just be open-minded, be considerate, be thoughtful, and don't let theorists do the thinking for you, okay? Read them, learn from them, and then think. And learn how to build up from the systems that we have now, you know? This is one of the reasons I really stress worker ownership, okay? Worker ownership, like if you could abolish the bourgeois as a class, have full worker ownership all across the economy, I don't pretend this would solve every economic problem, but I do know one thing. It would lead to a massive political paradigm shift and economic paradigm shift without requiring any fundamental restructuring of our economy. You could keep all the basic building blocks. Now, I do want to change those building blocks, but guys, which economic structure do you think is more likely to fundamentally reorient itself towards the principles of decommodification? One controlled by the workers or by the bourgeois? Like, think for a second, right? Obviously, you want the workers in charge first before you try to rein the economy towards some like radical decommodification. You need it globally as well, because if America tried this on its own and the rest of the world just sanctioned us into oblivion, it would be really bad. You know, you want like a global workers' revolution, and then you can tinker with the very complicated economic systems we live with towards achieving those goals. You know, that's the goal. That's the hope. You know, obviously it doesn't always, you know, play out that easy, but that's the hope. That's the dream. Okay, cut the segments. 2 hours. Go. Blip, blip.